The city was a beast that never slept, its heart a constant, pulsing rhythm of noise and light. On the nicer side of town, where the lights were softer and the noise was a polite hum, stood the restaurant called Garden of the Moon. It was a place of quiet elegance, where the air always smelled of ginger, garlic, and roasting meats. The tables were dark, polished wood, and the staff moved with a silent, graceful efficiency that made every customer feel important. This was where Kelechi found herself on a Tuesday evening, her first full week on the job. The uniform, a deep blue hanbok, felt both strange and beautiful against her skin. She was careful with it, smoothing down the silky fabric as she arranged polished chopsticks at an empty table. Kelechi was new to the city, having traveled from a much smaller, quieter place with a dream in her heart and very little money in her pocket. This job was her first real chance and she was determined to be good at it. She watched the other waitresses, how they glided between tables, their voices low and melodic as they described the specials. She practiced the names of the dishes in her head: bibimbap, galbi, japchae. The manager, Mr. Park, was a stern man who rarely smiled, but he was fair. He had told her that the most important rule was to make the customers feel comfortable and unseen at the same time. It was a difficult balance, and Kelechi's hands still sometimes trembled when she carried the heavy, stoneware bowls. As the evening drew on, the sky outside the large windows turned a deep, bruised purple. Rain began to fall, first in gentle taps, then in a steady drumming pour that streaked the glass. The restaurant, which had been comfortably busy, began to thin out. Kelechi was starting to think it would be a quiet end to her shift. And then the door opened. A gust of wet, cold air rushed in, followed by 3 men. They weren't loud or rude, but their entrance changed the very atmosphere of the room. The air grew still and heavy. The soft chatter from the remaining tables died down. Mr. Park, who had been tallying a receipt, immediately stood up straighter, his face becoming a careful, neutral mask. The man leading them was the one everyone's eyes flickered to. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long dark coat that dripped rainwater onto the expensive floor. His hair was black and perfectly styled, and his face was all sharp, serious angles. He didn't speak, but one of the men with him gestured to the best table in the house, a secluded booth in the corner. Mr. Park hurried over, bowing his head slightly. "Mr. Kim," he said, his voice respectful. "Your usual table is ready." The tall man, Mr. Kim, simply gave a single, slow nod. As he walked, his eyes scanned the room not with curiosity, but with a kind of cool ownership. They were dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail and find it lacking. Kelechi felt a nervous flutter in her stomach. This was clearly a very important and possibly very dangerous man. Mr. Park returned to the service station, his face pale. He looked directly at Kelechi. "Kelechi," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You will serve table 9. The gentleman in the corner. Be perfect. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make eye contact. Just take their order and bring the food. Do you understand?" Kelechi's mouth went dry. She nodded, unable to find her voice. She picked up a notepad and a pitcher of ice water, her hands feeling suddenly clumsy and foreign. As she approached the table, she could feel the weight of their silence. The 2 other men watched her, their expressions unreadable. The main man, Mr. Kim, was looking down at his phone, completely ignoring her. "Good evening," Kelechi stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "May I bring you something to drink?" One of the other men waved a hand. "Just water. And the usual food order. The boss knows what he wants." Kelechi nodded, pouring the water with a hand that shook just enough to make the ice cubes clink too loudly against the glass. When she poured for Mr. Kim, he still didn't look up. She felt a wave of relief and hurried back to the kitchen to put in the order. The food came up quickly. A spread of small dishes called banchan, then sizzling platters of meat, and finally, a large, heavy stone pot filled with a boiling hot seafood and tofu soup. The pot, called a jjigae, was steaming and furious, the red broth bubbling ominously. It was the main dish and it was for Mr. Kim. Kelechi took a deep breath, steadying herself. She carefully lifted the tray, balancing the heavy hot pot in the center. The walk from the kitchen to the corner table felt like a mile. She focused on her feet, on keeping the tray level. The heat from the pot seeped through the tray handles into her palms. She could hear the low murmur of the men's voices growing closer. She was almost there. Just a few more steps. One of the other men shifted in his seat, starting to stand up to make room. In his movement, his elbow knocked sharply against Kelechi's arm. It was just a bump, but it was enough. Time seemed to slow down. The tray tilted. The heavy, stone pot slid, teetered on the edge, and then crashed onto the table. A wave of scalding red soup and chunks of tofu and seafood splashed across the pristine white tablecloth, over the men's suits, and across Mr. Kim's lap. A deafening silence fell over the entire restaurant. The only sound was the final dull thud of the empty pot rolling on the table and then onto the floor. Kelechi stood frozen, her hands empty, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she felt dizzy. The two other men were on their feet, brushing furiously at their clothes, their faces twisted in anger. But her eyes were locked on Mr. Kim. He had moved with surprising speed, pushing his chair back to avoid the worst of the spill, but his trousers were still stained. He slowly, very slowly looked up from the mess on his lap. His dark eyes, cold and hard, rose to meet hers. Tears of pure terror welled in Kelechi's eyes. She was going to be fired. She was going to be yelled at. She was sure she was going to have to pay for the meal and the ruined clothes, which probably cost more than she made in a month. Her new life in the city was over before it had even begun. Mr. Kim stood up. He was even taller than she had realized, and he seemed to tower over her. He looked her up and down, from her frightened eyes to her shaking hands. Kelechi braced for the shout, for the storm of his anger. But it didn't come. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and calm, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "You're too small for this job," he said, his gaze unwavering. Kelechi felt the words like a physical blow, a confirmation of all her fears. But then he continued, his tone shifting into something that was not quite kindness, but was absolute authority. "But don't worry. I'll make it fit." He turned his head slightly, just enough to address the stunned Mr. Park, who was wringing his hands a few feet away. "Clean this up," he said, his voice still quiet but leaving no room for argument. "Bring a new meal. And bring the young lady a new uniform. This one is stained." He then looked back at Kelechi. The coldness in his eyes had softened, just a fraction, into something more like curiosity. "What is your name?" he asked. It took her a moment to find her voice. "Kelechi," she whispered. He repeated it as if tasting the word. "Kelechi." He gave another one of his small, almost imperceptible nods. Then he sat back down in his chair, ignoring the chaos around him as if nothing had happened at all. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Kelechi. She changed her uniform. The table was reset. A new, perfect meal was served. Mr. Kim and his men ate in silence. When they were finished and ready to leave, Mr. Kim walked past the service station. He stopped in front of Kelechi, who was trying to look busy by polishing already clean glasses. He didn't say a word. He simply reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded stack of money, and placed it neatly on the counter in front of her. It was a tip, but it was more money than she had ever seen at once. Then he turned and walked out into the rain, his men following behind him like shadows. Kelechi stood there, staring at the money, then at the door where he had disappeared. Her heart was still racing, but the fear had been replaced by a whirlwind of confusion. He wasn't what she had expected. He was powerful and scary, but he had also been fair. The words echoed in her mind, "I'll make it fit." She didn't know what they meant, not really, but a strange, warm feeling began to push aside the cold dread in her stomach. This was not the end of her story. It felt, for the first time that night, like a very strange beginning. The days that followed the spill were filled with a tense kind of anticipation for Kelechi. Every time the restaurant door opened, her heart would perform a little somersault, her eyes darting towards the entrance, half expecting and half fearing the return of the imposing Mr. Kim. But he did not come. The large tip he had left remained tucked safely in her small apartment, a tangible reminder of the strange encounter that felt more and more like a dream. She fell back into the rhythm of her new life, learning the menu, mastering the delicate art of setting a Korean table, and navigating the bustling, unfamiliar streets of the city. The initial terror of that night began to fade, replaced by a dull curiosity about the man who had the power to silence a room with his presence. It was exactly 1 week later, on another rainy evening, that he returned. This time he was alone. The clock showed 15 minutes until closing, and the restaurant was empty save for a single couple settling their bill. Kelechi was in the back, wiping down counters, when she heard Mr. Park's voice, suddenly alert and respectful. She peered out and saw him, standing just inside the doorway, shaking the rain from his dark coat. He was less formal tonight, dressed in a simple black sweater that made him seem slightly less like a king and more like a man, though a profoundly serious one. Mr. Park gestured for Kelechi. "Table 9, he said, his voice a mixture of command and unspoken warning. "He has asked for you." The walk to the table felt longer than it had the night of the spill. Her palms were damp, but this time it was a different kind of nerves. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was watching her approach, his dark eyes tracking her movement with a quiet, focused intensity. She stopped a respectful distance from the table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Good evening, Mr. Kim," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Kelechi," he replied, and the way he said her name with a certain weight and care made it sound entirely new. "I will have the doenjang jjigae. And a pot of barley tea." It was a simple, humble order, a comforting stew, not the lavish feast from his previous visit. She brought the tea first, her movements careful and precise. As she set the small teapot and cup on the table, he spoke again, his voice low. "The restaurant is quiet tonight." "It is, sir," she replied, unsure of what else to say. "The rain keeps people away." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the window where the city lights were smeared by the water on the glass. "It is a good night for quiet." He looked back at her. "You are not from this city." It wasn't a question but a statement. "No, sir," Kelechi answered. "I'm from a small town. It's very different here." "Tell me about it," he said, and he leaned back in his chair as if he had all the time in the world. And so, haltingly at first, she did. She told him about the wide, open fields behind her grandmother's house, where the sky felt enormous. She spoke of the loud, joyful chaos of family gatherings, so different from the polite silence of the restaurant. She found herself talking about her dream of going to school to study design, of creating beautiful things with her hands. He listened, truly listened, without interruption, his eyes never leaving her face. He didn't seem bored or impatient. He seemed interested. When his food arrived, he gestured for her to sit in the chair across from him for a moment. "You should take a break," he said. It was less a suggestion and more a gentle command. So she sat for just a few minutes while he ate a few spoonfuls of the stew. He asked her more questions about her family, about what she missed from home. The conversation was like a delicate dance, each step cautious and measured. This became their new routine. He would appear in the final hour before closing, always alone. He would sit at table 9, order a simple meal and ask for Kelechi. Their talks grew longer, stretching past closing time. Mr. Park would eventually leave, throwing a complex, unreadable look at Kelechi before locking the front door and leaving through the back, leaving them in the soft ambient light of the cleaned restaurant. It was during these conversations that the fortress around Junho, for he had told her his first name one night, the word feeling like a secret he was sharing, began to show cracks. He told her about the heavy responsibilities he carried, the business his father had built that now rested entirely on his shoulders. He spoke of the loneliness that came with his position, how people saw the title of boss, but never saw the man Junho who found peace in the quiet strokes of a paintbrush, who loved the works of old Korean poets. He confessed that the restaurant was one of the few places where he could simply sit and be, away from the constant demands and expectations. Kelechi listened, and in listening she began to see the lonely boy inside the powerful man. One evening, a group of loud, boisterous men came in just as Junho was about to leave. They had been drinking and their energy was aggressive and out of place in the calm space. One of them, a large man with a loud voice, kept snapping his fingers at Kelechi, demanding more beer, making comments about her in a language he thought she didn't understand. She tried to remain professional, but her discomfort was palpable. As she approached their table with another bottle, the loud man reached out and grabbed her wrist, his grip tight and insistent, pulling her slightly towards him as he slurred a joke to his friends. Kelechi froze, a shot of fear and revulsion coursing through her. Before she could even try to pull away, a shadow fell over the table. Junho was there. He hadn't moved quickly or made a sound, but his presence was suddenly immense, filling the entire space around them. He didn't look at Kelechi. His entire focus was on the man holding her wrist. His face was a calm, cold mask, but his eyes held a terrifying promise of violence. "Let her go," he said. His voice was not loud. It was, in fact, quieter than a whisper, but it cut through the men's laughter like a shard of ice. The drunk man, startled, looked up and met Junho's gaze. The color drained from his face. He released Kelechi's wrist immediately as if her skin had burned him. Sorry, sir. I didn't," he stammered. Junho did not reply. He simply continued to look at the man, his expression unchanging, until the man dropped his eyes and mumbled an apology to the table. Junho then turned, his body creating a shield between Kelechi and the table. He gently took her elbow and guided her away, back towards the safety of the service station. His touch was firm yet incredibly gentle. Once they were away from the table, he turned to her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice returning to the softer tone he used only with her. She shook her head, her whole body trembling from the adrenaline. "No, I'm okay." He reached out and his fingers, warm and steady, brushed against the skin of her wrist where the man had grabbed her. The touch sent a completely different kind of shiver through her, a warm, electric current that chased away the last of the fear. He looked down at the faint red marks on her skin, and a muscle in his jaw tightened. When he looked back into her eyes, the cold anger was gone, replaced by a deep, smoldering intensity. "No one," he said, his voice low and fervent, "will ever make you feel small again. I promise you this." In that moment, the last of the walls between them crumbled. The space between them seemed to shrink, charged with a feeling that had been growing for weeks. He was so close she could feel the warmth of his body. He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But she didn't. She rose onto her toes to meet him. Their first kiss was not a timid brush of lips. It was a confirmation, a sealing of a promise. It was soft yet certain, filled with all the unspoken words and shared understandings of the past weeks. It tasted of barley tea and longing and a fierce, protective warmth. When they finally parted, the world around them, the messy table, the silent restaurant, the rain outside, had simply fallen away. They stood forehead to forehead, breathing each other's air, and Kelechi knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that her life had irrevocably changed direction. This was no longer just a strange job in a big city. This was the beginning of something she could never have dreamed of. The world outside the quiet sanctuary of the restaurant began to press in. The secret hours that Kelechi and Junho stole for themselves, walking through midnight parks or talking for hours in his sleek, dark car, felt like a beautiful dream from which a harsh awakening was inevitable. Junho's world, the world of the family business, was not one that easily accepted outsiders, and certainly not one that welcomed change. Whispers began to circulate among the men who had followed Junho for years. They saw the way his stern focus had softened. They noticed how his phone, which was usually a constant extension of his hand, would sometimes remain ignored in his pocket while he shared a quiet smile with the waitress from Garden of the Moon. To them, this was not romance. It was a distraction. It was a crack in the armor of their leader, and cracks were seen as weaknesses to be exploited. The first sign of trouble was subtle. A car would follow Kelechi at a distance on her walk home, its headlights a silent, menacing presence. Then one of the senior men, a grim-faced figure named Sangwon who had been with Junho's father, came to the restaurant. He did not speak to Kelechi, but he sat at a table for a long time, his cold eyes watching her every move, his disapproval a tangible chill in the warm room. Mr. Park grew increasingly nervous, often suggesting to Kelechi that perhaps she should consider a job at a different restaurant, one in a less complicated part of the city. Junho knew what was happening. He could feel the shifting loyalties, the silent challenges. He tried to shield Kelechi from it, wrapping her in a protective bubble of his presence, but she was not a woman who could remain blind for long. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach whenever she saw the unfamiliar car or felt Sangwon's gaze. But a stronger emotion began to rise within her, one that had been forged in her own grandmother's kitchen, a spirit of fierce resilience. She would not be scared away. She would not be made to feel small. The confrontation came on a night when Junho was away, handling business he could not avoid. Sangwon and two other men entered the restaurant just after closing. Mr. Park had already left and Kelechi was alone, wiping down the last tables. The lock on the front door clicking shut sounded like a gunshot in the silent space. "Little girl," Sangwon said, his voice rough. "You have been having fun, yes? Playing a game you do not understand." He walked slowly towards her, his shoes echoing on the floor. "You are a hobby for him. A pretty distraction. But hobbies are forgotten. You are bringing a cloud over this family. You make him weak. It is time for you to disappear." Kelechi's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but she stood her ground, clutching the damp cloth in her hand like a lifeline. She thought of Junho's confession of loneliness, of the gentle way he held her face when he kissed her, of the man who loved poetry and art hidden beneath the boss. "You are wrong," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I'm not a cloud. And I do not make him weak." She took a small step forward, her chin held high. "You are afraid. You are afraid because he is changing, and you do not know how to live in a world that is not built on fear. But I am not afraid of you. The only thing I am afraid of is a life without him in it." Sangwon's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in fury. Her defiance was not part of his plan. He took another step, but at that moment the back door to the kitchen burst open. Junho stood there, his chest heaving, his face a storm of cold, controlled rage. He had returned early, a feeling of dread gnawing at him, and had heard everything. What happened next was not a loud, dramatic fight. It was something far more decisive. Junho walked to Kelechi's side, placing himself squarely between her and Sangwon. He did not shout. He spoke in low, measured tones, his words meant only for the men in the room. He spoke of legacy, not of the one built on intimidation, but of one that could be built on strength and respect. He spoke of his father's dreams, which were not just for power, but for a lasting, honorable family. And then, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more frightening than any yell, he made it clear. "Kelechi is not my distraction. She is my future. Anyone who has a problem with my future has a problem with me. And that is a war you will not win." The silence that followed was absolute. Sangwon looked from Junho's unyielding face to Kalechi's brave one, and he saw not weakness, but a new, unbreakable kind of strength. He gave a curt, defeated nod, and he and the other men left without another word. In the quiet that settled after they were gone, Junho turned to Kalechi. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, his face buried in her hair. When I heard his voice, "I have never known such fear," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. Weeks later, on the rooftop of his building, the city was spread out before them like a blanket of stars. The air was cool and clean. Junho had changed everything. He had dismantled the old, feared parts of his business, building something new, something legitimate and strong. The weight that had always seemed to bow his shoulders was gone. He stood tall and free. He took both of Kalechi's hands in his. His thumbs stroked her knuckles gently. "You walked into my life like a storm," he began, a soft smile on his lips. "You spilled soup and turned my ordered gray world into a riot of color. You saw the man behind the title and you were not afraid. You stood for me when others stood against me. You fit into my life, Kalechi, not by changing who you are, but by making my life the right shape for you." He let go of one of her hands and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a simple, breathtaking ring, a single diamond that caught the starlight. "You are my courage and my peace. Will you build this new, beautiful life with me? Will you stay with me forever?" Tears of pure joy streamed down Kalechi's face as she looked from the ring to the face of the man she loved. The man who had told her he would make it fit, and had, in every way, kept his promise. "Yes," she whispered, her voice full of love. "Yes, Junho. Forever." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, the final piece of their puzzle clicked into place. Their love story, which had begun with a trembling waitress and a terrifying boss, had been tested by fire and forged into something unbreakable. It was a story of finding courage in the most unexpected places, and of discovering that forever could begin with a single life-changing spill. Did their journey of building a new life together capture your heart? If you want to discover more unique love stories that blossom against all odds, be sure to subscribe for future tales.